my cohort Jason's right here. This is his first Drupal camp, so everybody say hi, Jason. Welcome to Drupal camp. I've been doing Drupal sites for about 4 years, and this is my 4th Drupal camp. I got into it with theming, and we basically specialize in building sites. Doing the theming, the backend stuff. We have our own clients. We also do contract work. So if anybody has a company, anybody's a company looking for theming, that sort of thing, we're certainly available. So what I want to talk about today is getting sassy with Drupal, which is, I think, just a silly headline. But Sass is basically a better way of doing CSS. And it's not necessarily Drupal specific. It's just a better way to get to write code. It basically helps turn CSS into more functional, almost like a programming language, so to speak. So Sass stands for syntactically awesome style sheets. And what it does, and I'm going to go over some of these features. So I'm going to actually show you by changing some regular CSS into Sass. But you can find information about Sass at sass-lang.com. And there's a whole tutorial, a lot of useful documentation, and that sort of thing, the API, all that sort of stuff, is on the site. So what Sass does is basically lets you add things like variables and nested code, and it saves you a lot of time in terms of writing CSS. Because normally with CSS you'll have navbar, then navbar ul, navbar ulli, navbar ullia. But with like Sass, you can nest it, so you can just write it just write it once, and it all gets nested in there. You can also do really cool stuff like import other Sass files into themselves, so you can move all your certain things and all of your commonly used styles, which is actually going to be talked about in the next session about Compass, which is not me, but is being done, I think, in the same room by David Parsons. I don't know if he's in here, but Compass is really cool, and he's going to talk about that, so that's something to definitely get into as well. But there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with Sass. So what it basically is it's a Ruby. It runs in Ruby, and it's free, and you can run it on Windows or Mac. If you have a Mac, you can basically just open up a terminal window, and to install it, you just type gem install Sass, and it'll install it on your computer. If you have Windows, there's a whole separate thing. You have to install Ruby on your Windows computer, and then go in and do what you need to do with that. But it's basically still a Ruby gem, so it lets you just install it on your system and go from there. And it basically it runs as it can run in the background. It can run however you want to do it. And what Sass essentially does is it takes, let's see all my files real quick. It takes a CSS file that you write it as a .scss file, and Sass compiles that down into a CSS file, because browsers can't read Sass files; they just read CSS files. So it turns it into a file that the browser can read, but it gives you the flexibility of writing the code in a better way with better options like variables and mixins and imports and all sorts of other stuff that you can't normally do in CSS. And I'm going to show you some of those too. But so basically, yeah, so you install it like this, and with just gem install Sass, and then once it's installed, it runs, but you have to actually tell it to start watching your files to start compiling them, because otherwise it's not going to do that. So what you do, you can do this through the terminal, or the equivalent in Windows. It's been so long since Windows, I don't remember. But you can run sass-watch, and then whatever your CSS file is named, and then whatever you want it to output into. There's also GUIs out there that do this. I use a neat one called Live Reload, which lets you load things in the browser. You can make your changes locally, and it'll compile everything. There's also another free one out there called Scout. These are just like little Adobe Air applications that basically monitor. You tell it to turn on, and it'll watch a directory for you. You just load load the directory that you want to load, and it'll just watch for those files. So you can do it depending on what you're more comfortable with. You can do it in terminal and just have a little terminal window open, or you can use one of those GUIs. So now let's kind of get into what it actually does. So I built this little site. This is just an Omega theme. Really simple, just a 2-page site with some views. So this is the home page, and I just put some really crappy styling on here just to make it visible. Is that okay? You can't really see the border around that. There's a little border around this box, but just basic stuff, italics and colors and that sort of thing. And then I just did a simple view page with different colored text and different borders, and nothing real complicated. So this is the code, and I'll blow that up a little bit. Can you guys see that okay? Yeah, it looks like it. Okay, so let's kind of go through this a little bit. I'm using the Open Sans font, and I'm doing this by doing font face kits right here. So I have all these font faces. This is just a regular CSS file, just basic CSS. And I have the body tags, the H1. I just overwrote Omega's basic styles. Just basic color stuff, and then I'm getting into front page specific CSS right here, and then the about page specific CSS. So I just wrote out, this is how you would normally write out, a CSS. I was a little bit more detailed than you probably have to be with getting into the region, content, view, working my way down, but that was just more for demonstration. But you guys get the point. So one of the first things you can do, and you can do this in regular CSS too, but this is useful for things that are just beyond the normal import of a media query. Like all of this font code, I don't need this at the top of my file. That's just extra code right here. It makes the file bigger. So with Sass, what I can do is I can move all this code into a new file. Actually, whoops. Sorry. I can save all these files, and this is what's called an import. So what I'm basically doing is taking all this CSS and going to put it into another file. And I can call it with Sass by just calling it with an import function. So I actually already did this for this code, but now what I'm doing is basically moving all the font face stuff over there. So if you have a site that has a lot of fonts, and you don't want it all just be bottled up inside of one code, but you don't want to include a whole other style sheet, you can just put it into a separate file. Now with Sass, the way the naming structure is, you can actually name it whatever .scss or .sass, but you have to put a underscore in front of it. That tells Sass to basically look for those type of files. So I can take all of my code that I just cut out and just put import fonts, save it, and I've got my little program here that is compiling it for me. Right here, this is the live reload program. It's $10 for Mac. It's free for Windows. It's definitely worth it, I think. And so that you don't see any change, but the fonts are actually still here. So if I took out this one line, or let's see, if I went in and changed this, just gutted out the Open Sans regular that I had. Now it's just going to fall back to. Now it's going to fall back to something else. So what you can see is that it's the only thing that's being called in here is that call to that import. So I took all of that code and I just moved it over to a different file. Now why this is useful is because then you can make your own, as many of these little import files as you want to, and you can put little snippets of code that you want to use in other places here. So like, okay, here's my import of just, I don't know, views. So you put all your views over here, or you can move them this way, or put whatever you want to these files. So that's an import. Another thing that you can do with Sass that is really cool is variables. So for instance, on these colors right here, like for the link colors, I have red, orange, and green for visited, hover, etc. I can make a variable like that, and then what it'll do, and I totally blanked on the.
It's just a colon.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I was like, for some reason I couldn't remember it. So I can set this to, well, I'll just say red. So now color is red, but I can just call it right here as link red. And now my links should stay the same. Actually, I'll just change it to, what do I want to call it? let's see what the orange is the color there, so we'll say we'll do an orange one. And I'll say yellow instead. So change orange to yellow. And so now, and again, this is just really simple variable stuff, but you can make as many variables as you need, and so if you're familiar with other programming, you can do it's basically making a variable, so you can put whatever you want in here, and you can of course mix variables throughout, and all that sort of stuff. Another neat thing that you can do is you can, rather than having the a visited, a hover, you can do inside of the same tag, and this is an example of the nesting. When I say nesting, I mean basically you just work your way down like you would like in a function in PHP or anything else, where it's like everything is inside of the brackets. So you put brackets inside of brackets. But with Sass, you can also do the pseudo states of CSS. So like the visited, the all it is just the colon or the and sign, and then a colon, and then the hover state. And this basically is writing out this code, but it's putting it all into this one thing. So we'll say hover is like red, and now I just cut out some lines of code here. So I don't need this because it's going to compile it here. Oh, it's still orange. That's right. I made yellow orange. Yeah, so there's my hover state. So if you look at the code, actually inspect it, color orange. So it's already outputting the color as it should. And this is already just getting it's reading that pseudo class just from in here. So it's nesting in here. So that's just kind of a simple nesting. Another neat thing you can do is do operators, and this is also, I'm trying to kind of just touch over the basics of this because it could probably be a whole conference on Sass itself with all the different things that you can do with it. If you really want to see it, the Florida Drupal site, Florida Drupal Camp site was built with Sass. There's some really cool stuff like all the animations, all of that sort of stuff. If I have time, I'll kind of show you guys a little bit of the files because Jason and I were a little bit involved in the theming of that. But one of the other things you can do is operators, which essentially you can do math with your CSS. So for instance, the body tag, like this is just a white background. But if I want to do, say I want to make it a certain color, I can do lighten or darken, and then I can say, let's say black, and then let's lighten the black 25%. So now the background of the page is going to be that color. If we make it 80%, it's gray like that. So I'm basically having the Sass is compiling this, and it's taking, okay, what's 80% of the color of black, the 000. And then you can do other things too with that, like you can subtract, certain percentages off of a padding or a margin, that sort of thing. Like the Sass site actually has a lot of really good examples for that sort of stuff. And there's also with Compass and other, I don't know if you're not necessarily called frameworks, but other parts of other add-ons that people have made for Sass. There's lots of different tools and features like this that are out there. So let's go to, like, for instance, the view page. So anybody who's done Drupal knows that Drupal spits out a ton of classes. There's more classes than we probably would ever need to use, especially for a view, because just to get to, just the page itself, you have the block that it's in, then you have block inner, then content, then the view name, then the view content, then the views row, then the field itself, then the field content, then the href. So you have lots of stuff to choose from. But where that can get really annoying with Drupal is if you have to reuse a lot of the same views on different pages. So for instance, say you want all of your pages to have one, all of your views to be, you're just going to have like a news listing and a blog listing and, donors or board of directors, whatever. Say you don't want to have to keep rewriting out this, the usual padding bottom, padding right margin to 20, whatever. What you can do with Sass is make what's called a mixin. So a mixin is essentially just almost like a variable, but you're basically you're putting this @mixin symbol in front of it, and then you can name it whatever you want. So views row. So now I'm saying, okay, for all my views, I want to put for my odd. Right now this page I have the odd ones and the even ones styled differently. So this is like a dotted border, and then this is a dash border, and they have different colors and sort of thing. But the margins and the spacing are the same between the two. So let's make sure that that stays the same. So I can say padding bottom, 20 pixels, margin bottom, 20 pixels. And we'll say border. We'll just change it all to solid border. So 3 pixels, solid, and let's do fuchsia because fuchsia's bright and fun. So now I have all this code for the views row odd, but now I can just say include views row, and this will change all of those to that. So you can make as many this kind of builds on top of itself, because you could make a bunch of mixins for your different views or your commonly reused things, and then you could build, put those in separate individual files, and then you can import those in as you need them. So if you work in Drupal, a lot of times you usually have one main style sheet, but other sites, like I said, this isn't necessarily Drupal specific, but if you have other sites that you do and you have different style sheets, you can import different things into different style sheets, and you can set it all up that way. But so we can change all of these. You can basically write these mixins, and especially if you do really common stuff like this, like I said, like that all of your sites are going to have the same padding, the same spacing, and all that sort of stuff. You can change them. You can save these for later on and do them, reuse the same code, and that's where Compass comes in, because Compass, and the guy's not here, so I'm not stepping on his toes, hopefully. Compass basically gives you a lot. It's compass-style.org. Compass is a framework, and it gives you basically a ton of commonly used functions and things that you could use in CSS and Sass. It gives you basically stuff that commonly used elements like colors, things that you can just use. And Compass is a little bit different without setup. I'm not going to get too much into it, but it runs like Sass does. So it gives you all of these different functions that you can reuse, that you can use in the that you can import in, like a grid background, for instance. Making sure your footer stays sticky, that sort of stuff. It's really cool, but it's a whole session unto itself. So now with views, there's also so we have all of these. We have the mixins, and we have the imports, and we also have let's see, like there's one other one I wanted to mention. Oh, I didn't really get into the arguments. I didn't really have time, unfortunately, to build an example of this, so I'll just kind of use their example. Arguments is, you can use mixins to, I guess, argue with themselves. So you can use a different mixin to, figure out certain things. So for instance, you have this mixin rounded, and they have the variables vert, horizontal, radius, and then they set the variable radius to 10 pixels. So now they can say, okay, vertical border, vertical horizontal radius is whatever. So then now down here, they're using this rounded, and then they're feeding in top and left as the arguments to those variables. So what you're getting over here, the nav bar, is border, top left, radius 10 pixels. Mods border, radius top left. So if you have to, especially if you have to work with difference between Chrome and Firefox and Opera and IE with all the different browser extensions in the front, there's lots of different. This helps save time, because you can basically predefine what you're going to give to these mixins. Does that make sense? Okay. I feel like it makes sense in my head, but I want to make sure I'm not losing anybody too much here. Yeah, I didn't have the time to set that up on my demo site, but that's actually pretty simple and straightforward to do. Now, another thing with the how this is a little bit more Drupal specific, especially with, and I'm just using Omega as an example here because it's a really popular theme. Omega gives you this front class, and then so that shows up on the front page. So I have all these front specific classes, and then with Sass, with the nesting that I was talking about earlier, so I can set a variable I can start out with front, and then I want to say, okay, this is all I'm going to do region content. So all the stuff is going to be in the region content. So now I can say, okay, H1 page title, and I'll put all my code for that in here. So what I'm basically doing is rewriting this chunk of code into Sass so that it's reusable. So moving all this here, get rid of this one because I don't need that anymore. Now I don't have to keep rewriting this, so I can just go in here. So I can just say, okay, now let's do content, and then we'll work on field name body, because these are both using that same one. And then I'll do H3, and that's just the code for this. I'm neurotic with my code, sorry. And then I have the p tag down here. So copy that over. So I'm basically doing the exact same thing that all that chunk of code was doing before, but I just moved it into something that's much easier to read and it's nested. So it starts with, all of these classes are going to get carried over. So it'll be front, region content, H1 page title, and then content, and then you can work your way down, and you can go further in. I could go, basically as deep as I wanted to. I could say A, color blue, and then I could even get into the hover state just for right here. Pink is in the color? Yeah. So what this really does is this makes it a lot easier to maintain and change your code later on. Because if you have to go back, especially if you're using mixins, like you can just go up and change the mixin once, and it'll change it throughout the whole page where you're changing the mix, where you included that mixin. If you have all your content staggered like this, you can go all your code staggered like this. It's easy to just go back and find it rather than having to go back and worry about making a typo or that you didn't copy something over correctly. You just change it in one spot, and it's easier to follow and read. And the browser just reads it as regular CSS, because if we open up the CSS file, this has already pulled in all of the imported fonts that I had. So it writes all those in there, keeps all the body stuff. Then it has all of my A tags, and then it wrote out the CSS like you would normally write it out, but it does it in a way that the browser can see, but you're not touching that. So the code is a lot cleaner, it's a lot easier to maintain. My views down here, views row has the same things. You don't see the mixins and all that sort of stuff because they're all just contained in the Sass file, but they're there in the CSS, they get spit out. So, and you can also, and Sass is also really good about breaking. It'll tell you if you broke something. And if you're using a WYSIWYG, or I'm sorry, not WYSIWYG, a GUI interface for your compiling, then you'll get it usually in that. Or if you're using it in terminal or the command prompt window, then you'll get the information. It'll show it there. Now, there are some problems sometimes where the debugging gets stuck. At least in Windows, Jason's had that issue before. I've never seen it happen, but it hangs or something, so you have to relaunch it. That may just be a bug in it. But for instance, if you forget to put a bracket in your code right here, this just told me right here invalid CSS after so-and-so, after that bracket, it was basically looking for another bracket. And when you compile it and then you try to refresh it, it's gonna it basically took away all my CSS because it stops right where the error was. So now if I go back and fix it, the error goes away and the code comes back. So depending on how you're doing this, it'll tell you if you have an error or not, which is useful just for the sake of if something breaks, you're going to know exactly where it is, where it happened. And sometimes it'll spit it out actually in the code and print it out at the top of the page, or different places. Like I said, different little compilers do different things, but it's really good about getting the errors, and you can go back to the line, fix it, and then you can move on from there. So how is this useful in Drupal? Well, the thing that Sass does is it compiles locally, versus there's another sort of tool out there called less, which is similar to Sass, but less compiles on the server through a JavaScript query. Sass compiles locally. So with Drupal and everything is served, it's all served up through the browser. If you have caching on, it's already been run like that. So basically, you have to just put the Sass file and the CSS file on there, and you already have compiled them locally before you go to move them to the site itself. Whereas you can run with less, you can actually have it run on the site and have it run as a compile. Have it compile it in the site like that itself. But with Drupal, a lot of the times that it's useful for Drupal because themes and modules even are still just have CSS files. So if you're familiar with CSS, you write and you theme and do things in CSS. You just can write your extra CSS, your Sass files, and then have it spit out into CSS, and you can just move over whatever ones you want. Now there's also some of the themes, Zen, and I believe Omega, the newest version of Omega 4 when that comes out, is going to have support for Sass built into it. So Zen already has, Zen 5 has support for Sass and Compass built into it. Omega is going to have the same sort of thing. So what that means is it'll integrate in this case, I believe Zen will actually compile it for you. And I'm not sure how Omega is going to do it. I haven't really looked into that. But there's different ways of doing it, so that you may not even need a compiler. You can just write your Sass files, put them up there, and then Drupal will do it for you. And there is actually a Sass module, but it doesn't really have a lot of usage. So that is, anybody who's new to Drupal, I don't know how many newbies we have, but if you're ever on Drupal.org, you're trying to figure out if a module is good, look at how many sites are using it. That's not always the case, because if it does something specific that you really need it to do, who cares if it only has 2 people? But modules that may only have a couple hundred sites being used means they're probably not well maintained, or they're not really, there may be a better option out there. So, just FYI. So there are some limitations and problems with Sass. It's essentially an all or nothing sort of thing, and by that I mean when you write Sass. If you're working by yourself, if you're the only themer or the only designer, you have to go all in on it. And if you have a team of people, they have to go all in on it. What that means is you can't, once it's already been written and you start working in Sass, you can't go back and just edit the CSS file. Because if you edit the CSS file, the next time Sass compiles it, it's going to erase whatever was in the CSS file. Because it's going to recompile it and it's going to say, oh, well, we don't need this we don't need this in here, just overwrite it. That can be a problem when you turn a site over to a client, especially if they're tinkering, if they like to tinker with their site. So you have to either do one of 2 things, and this is what we found. You either have to come to a point where you stop, compiling in Sass, and you just go back and change it manually through the CSS, or you train the people who are going to be maintaining the site on, hey, this is how you do it. Usually, my experience has been when you have shops that actually want to tinker with their own website, they have a designer or a graphic person on staff who may have a little bit of web experience, and so you can usually train them a little bit into it. Say, hey, okay, download this program. When you're making your changes, just save it. Make sure you're running this thing. And most people don't have a hard time with it. If you do get a lot of resistance, you just have to kind of accept the fact that, okay, Sass is done for me, but now we're just going to work in CSS. Because ideally, when you're not, if you're just turning a site over to a client, the only work that you're going to have to do is just any sort of maintenance thing. And honestly, I can live with going in there and hunting down something in the CSS file, because the other thing that Sass can do, and my editor was not doing this, but you can, it can actually input comment tags in terms of what line it corresponds to in the Sass file. So it would put like, let's see, this A tag is line 20, so it would say, what am I doing? That's HTML. Line 20, global .css. So it'll tell you what, where it starts with that. So it adds a little bit extra code in that sense, but that can also be really useful if you want to go back and, because you can still work with the Sass, as long as you have the Sass files as like source files, you can go back and edit it, then save it, then just push the CSS up, and then no one's ever the wiser. But if you're turning it over to a site, to a client, they just have to be aware of how that works, because otherwise they're going to break something. They're going to go in there and tinker with it, and then they're going to ask you 6 months later to fix something. You're going to overwrite what they had, and it's going to be a big mess. As far as I know, there's no way to go back to to overwrite the CSS. Dustin, do you know? I'm sorry, I'm calling you out. Yeah, no. Once it's been compiled, if someone goes back and edits the actual CSS file, is there any way to get it to not read that?
No.
Okay.
It's going to recompile and
override it. Okay.
Ignore it. Not that I know of. No.
Okay. So that's the biggest limitation.
You're all in, like you said.
Yeah, if that's the biggest limitation, it's just an all-in sort of thing. But once you start really getting into Sass and start working on it and doing everything that it's that it can do, and especially if you do a lot of CSS all the time, you're gonna wonder why you ever did it any other way, because it's so much easier. Go ahead.
So you're gonna add another style sheet and just put
Yeah, that's another option. Like
another sheet that's not being touched, and all your global and
right,
and default and all that is getting overwritten with the Sass stuff that's compiled. So you probably could, it's just probably not the best idea.
Yeah, so what you were saying, just so the camera picks it up, is basically making another style sheet for the client to use or someone else to use when they're editing it. And you could just include that in your info file for your theme. Basically let them just tinker in that file and then just have that get included. And then the problem with that, though, then I guess becomes if they start overwriting your CSS in their file, then you have the issue of, conflict that way. But at least they're not tinkering with the Sass too much, and you're not going to lose their changes if you save it. So again, it gets a little tricky. It's all going to depend on your situation with the client. I mean, a lot of people just say, you'll build a website for someone, and then you'll say, okay, you're the maintainer. They don't do anything with it. They just go to you for changes, so you don't have to worry about it. But then you have people who want to get hands-on in there, so those are the people you really have to educate. Otherwise, they're going to break something, get upset, and you're going to have to go back and redo work. Just basically the other thing too is you just have to make sure that you're compiling it as you go along. Make sure you have your program running, or you have your terminal window open, or your command prompt window open, because otherwise you're going to wonder why these changes are not happening. You're hitting reload and reload and reload, and nothing is showing up. I've been there. I have a 1-year-old, and it's hard to work with a kid and try to stay focused when you're coding. So anyway, that's just about it for what I had prepared for this. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Oh, okay. We'll just work down. Go ahead.
I assume that you do not keep the CSS that's generated in your source control, or is that true?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you keep the CSS that's generated in your source control system or not?
I do. I mean, with Git, you're talking about like using Git. Yeah. I mean, the CSS, because you still the browser is still seeing the CSS file. That's the actual important file.
Right.
Are you asking, do you keep the Sass file in the version control system?
Well, I know you would have to keep the Sass file because that's what you want to go back to if you revert it.
Yeah. So I mean, you would keep both of them because the browser's not gonna. The browser isn't gonna read the SCSS file, and even if it did, even if you had someone had the link to download it, then it would still, they're just going to get a CSS, basically a Sass file, which is nothing in there other than CSS. I mean, it's not like it's a security risk or anything like that, because there's nothing in there that's so specific that it's going to be, a problem. So, I guess depending on how you use your version control system, if you're committing and stuff all the time, then you may not want to include it. But maybe just once you get to the production level, stop including it then. But once you get out of development, you can include it then, I guess. Yeah. You had a question? You had the same question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
IE, does it play well with IE? Does the IE read the CSS?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It gets, obviously IE is IE, so you have issues that happen, but most of the time that's more when you get into CSS3, and depending on what version of IE you're dealing with. There are a lot of browser specific prefixes that come out that you can include in some Compass and other language, frameworks out there that build off of Sass have a lot of that stuff already built into it as well, so it kind of covers some of the IE side of things. But again, it's still spitting out just a regular CSS file. So if IE can read the CSS, then you're fine. I mean, it's just whatever the browser can support is whatever it's gonna see. Yeah.
Just kind of follow up to that, like Zen, for example, comes with a Mixin. If you want to support IE 6 and 7 with their layouts, you just turn on one line of code, and IE stuff comes in and fixes it all for you. So
good.
In some respects, Sass is better for compatibility because you can control that compatibility with code as opposed to this little hack does this.
Yeah, I was gonna say you can kind of get away from the browser hacks, the prefixes and all that.
They're still there. It's just in a controlled environment that you just add.
No, I don't use it. Is it a script or is it the CSS fixes?
What it does is it changes the way the mixins get compiled.
Okay.
I think it touches almost every line of the layout code in Zen.
Okay.
The way it handles it, and it just adds compatibility. But if you don't need that compatibility,
you can turn it off.
It's off by default.
Okay. Cool. Well, yeah. Six is dead.
Off.
Seven is almost completely dead. 8 needs to die, and then we just work on 9 and 10. I'll be happy with that.
Yeah, so some of the compass stuff actually is helpful, because it'll actually, if you want to like a border radius, you just type one line saying border radius, 5 pixels, and then that's going to go grab the compass, Mixin helper, that's going to pull in all the extra support from Mozilla, border radius and IE and all that stuff, and it always has like kind of the newest way that things are being done too, so it's always kind of up to date and all that.
Right.
So there's a whole bunch of helpers that will just do a lot of that other extra lifting for you, so you kind of just focus on, I just want border radius.
Yeah, just border radius, and that's it. Yeah.
Can you talk about rendering your CSS? So when you render the CSS out, you can change the settings.
Correct. With Sass, you can
compress. Do you want
right.
Find my line.
I like to be able to go back and read it, but you can actually minify the CSS, and you can change the. Where is it on here? No, it's on the front page. How it's compiled, you can change how it basically nests it, how it outputs it. So it'll start out with nesting, or then expanded. You can compact it, and you can even compress it. So you can get all of your code into one long line of CSS, which will help reduce make the file smaller and make it easier to read. I mean, if you have compression on in Drupal anyway, it's going to do that. It's going to compress it anyway, but this is also another way to, nest it or expand it or compact it, however you want to do it. It'll output the CSS however you want it to do it. You just specify when you're telling it to compile in the editor, or I'm sorry, the program. You can tell it how you want it to compile it through terminal or whatever you're using to do it with. Yeah.
Is there a reason to choose to write it in SCSS over Sass?
The file extension?
Yeah, but I know the syntax.
No, it'll use either one. I mean, I just go off of what they recommend on the site, which was always just SCSS, but it'll read either one. And again, it just depends. It also actually depends on your code editor. I mean, I use Coda too, and it'll do. You can, if I save it as a Sass file or a SCSS file, it'll edit it and read it like that. But Sass itself will compile it that way. Like that's why I said like the fonts file, where I have the underscore on, I could have saved this fonts.sass or fonts.scss, and it'll read either one. So, anybody else? Okay, I have a nice free book to give away, jQuery Mobile. This is the most theming-oriented one that was left when I picked up the books. So, well, there was a WordPress theming, but I was like, well, that seems kind of, so I guess who has? Let's try to narrow this down. Who's their first Drupal camp? Florida Drupal camp. All right, you guys keep your hands up. Oh, you guys, Jason, you don't count. Put your hand down. Who drove here? Where did you drive from?
Boca.
Boca.
A mile away.
A mile away. Hand down. Where
Sarasota.
Sarasota.
Orlando.
Hand down. I'm trying to find the furthest away. So we got Boca. Who drove further from than Boca to get here? All right. Free book. It's really hard to give these books away because I'm like, everybody's awesome. Everybody needs a book. You know, who do I give it to?
Thank you, Jersey.
I flew from Indiana.
You don't. Yeah, but you flew in with.
He wins.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions or anything? Okay, cool. Well, thank you guys. Hopefully you learned something. And oh, and by the way, also in your bags I have those. We gave out the cool little